Okay, hello. Welcome to my presentation on my research on the Homewood Privy. So I got to go inside the privy, and these are some photographs that I took. And this is the inside. And so the ceiling up in the top left that's cracking is plaster, and the panels are, they're wood. And Michelle was telling me this, that they are thought to be American chestnut, but that is not 100% sure, but we think it is pretty much 100% sure, which is cool because American chestnut are just really neat trees in and of themselves. And so the bottom left photo is a picture of the inside on the side that is larger and has little seats that are called children's seats. And the lower seats, I think, they're in a different were thought to be used for children. And then the top right is a picture looking out the window, which I thought was really interesting to think of when you're inside using the privy, how there's a window looking right in and how you can see out, and just sort of wondering about what that dynamic would have been like. And then the bottom right is a picture from the other side, the smaller side that does not have the children's seats, and we couldn't get in there. And so the picture is blurry because it's taken through the window. But what's interesting to me is that there are two sides to this privy, and I'm going to speak a little bit more about that. So these are pictures. I started my research going through, or a big part of my research was going through Habs reports of other buildings and other privies. So after I researched the information specifically about the Homewood Privy, sort of its history and architecture, which is pretty much tied into the history and architecture of the house, I started looking for examples of other surviving privies from the same time period, the early 19th century, in the Chesapeake and Mid-Atlantic. And so I found some really cool photographs. So this is the privy in 2005, I think it was. And you can see it looks a little different than it does today with the trees. And what I think is cool is that that used to be the formal gardens of the house. And it's hard to sort of imagine what it would have been like looking at the privy through these fancy gardens and having to walk through those rather than just flat grass, or here there's a few trees, whereas now there's no trees really in between the house and the privy. And so these are more pictures from the same report. And then this is my favorite photograph. It's from 1936, and it's of the privy. And you can see how different it was with all these trees. I just think it's a really cool photo to imagine the campus looking like this. And the doors are different. And yeah, so the door on the left is the smaller side, and then the door here on the right is the larger side. And so I chose, after all this research, I chose 3 topics to sort of focus on in my interpretive plan. And the first topic sort of stemmed from looking at the physical aspects of the privy, like how it has 2 rooms and multiple seats, and then thinking about what that meant in terms of privacy for the people who used it. And so I looked at some other privies, and what I focused on for the Homewood privy was, did multiple people use the privy at the same time, since there are several seats in each side, and what might that have been like? And then I just think that's a really interesting concept because it's sort of different, but also similar to situations today. And so this is another privy surviving in Maryland from the late 18th century, early 19th century. And it's also made of brick with the same sort of pyramid type roof with 2 windows on either side. And so it gives sort of a good example that this was a common type of privy for people who had the money to build these, and these families were well off in this area at this time. And there's all sorts of seats here. And so the shorter ones, that's what I was saying about children's seats. And so I was, in my plan, I raised the question of what would it have been like, because there were so many children at Homewood during this time, to use the privy with children all at once, and sort of thinking about how hectic that might be, or what the actual experience might be like going in, looking through the windows, and everything like that. And so Also, this is not, I didn't really mention this in my plan, but what I think is interesting is that or I did a little bit, the privy has two sides. So it's kind of funny how people were divided into two rooms. A lot of people assume that it's based on gender, but as far as I could find, that's what a lot of people just say, but I couldn't find any, I guess, primary sources that reference that. So I think it's interesting to think about the divisions about who could sit together openly and then who had to use different rooms. So that's all these sorts of questions and ideas that I raise and provide some information on in my interpretation. And here's another one with similarly several seats and lower seats. And this is another type of privies that has two. They're very similar. On the left is the West Privy, and this is the East Privy. And they're two different buildings. And so that sort of goes into my question of who would have used, were different people using different buildings or different rooms, which I'm going to go back to my pictures of Homewood to talk about this. So then the next part, a big question throughout my whole research was, did the enslaved people who were at Homewood, were they allowed to use this privy or not? And it was hard to find a definitive answer. And that was something I was really interested in. I checked, so I couldn't find any, I guess, historical documentation from this house on that. And the resources or the research that has been done doesn't give me, people didn't say one way or another for sure. There is evidence I found of, or there is a site about Jefferson's house, I think it was at Monticello, where he had all sorts of privies, all very fancy, and he liked to design them with some weird little inventions. And so that was kind of interesting, but they said that they had been thinking there's so many privies in different areas, but they did not find an answer of who used them and if the enslaved people he had used them. And they did find information that the people who were enslaved at Monticello had to clean them out. And that is something that is commonly accepted as being a task for if a family, a landowning family like the Carrolls, they had people who were enslaved on their property, they would have had that task of dealing with this, as well as the chamber pots inside the house. And so that's sort of something I also wanted to think about, was the realities of this situation, of how the privy. So the second theme that I talked about was how, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. My second theme was how the privy was so different and a privilege for the Carrolls from the rest of Baltimore. And so I looked into the history of the city in the early 19th century, sort of its political growth, its social population increase, and the public health that went along with it. And the city was, this was a lot, came from a book called Scraping By, which is a really good, I guess, title for it because it sounded pretty awful and very harsh living conditions. And most people didn't have, the majority of people in Baltimore at this time didn't have a nice separate building where they could keep all their business separate and away and have this convenience. And so I was thinking about that. My second theme is sort of talking about the realities of most people in Baltimore versus what the Carrolls had and how they were able to forget about what they did in the privy because they had that luxury and the wealth that enabled them to do that. And I found some really cool anecdotes about Baltimore at this time, that a lot of the waterways and even the inner harbor were really, really, really gross because people were dumping chamber pots in the streets and they were all, or into the water, and they were flowing into the harbor. And it was unclean. And there was people who had to actually work on this something called the mud machine, which was dredging the harbor to make it deeper. And they had to work on that machine standing in this water that was contaminated with waste and working in the mud that was also contaminated. And so that sort of anecdote gave me, or just made me think about how the conditions and how so many people had to face the realities of waste and what happened in this privy, and they didn't have this nice little place to use. And so then my third point is about how the Carrolls had, how the people who were enslaved at Homewood, how they were the ones who had to deal with what was in the privy, and how oftentimes, especially or throughout the history of privies, which is a long, really long and interesting history, actually, even tracing through medieval times, how people sort of conceptualized as privies as the vault, just sort of as a void. They would throw things in there and they would consider them gone and done and hidden and sort of out of sight, out of mind. And I thought that was super interesting because to the Carrolls, whatever went in the privy was gone because they never had to deal with it again. But for the enslaved workers who had to deal with it, those things were not gone, and they were pretty grim reality of the things that they were made to do. And also, I think archaeologically, there's a whole lot of excavation and evidence and material culture that comes out of privies, and it's a lot of really interesting things. Like people would throw bottles in there, and in places where alcohol was prohibited, you can find like alcohol bottles in there of people hiding them because and other sorts of contraband. And so it sort of goes to show the idea that privies were a place of, I guess, getting rid of things, but that wasn't actually the case because people would end up taking the contents and then they'd have to transfer them somewhere else and dump them, and then they would be somewhere even more public, perhaps like the waterways of Baltimore. Your stuff could end up there for everyone to see. And there was another little anecdote I mentioned in my plan as sort of just a story to talk about this topic. Is in Boston in 1849, a man or a professor at Harvard Medical College murdered this very well-known businessman, and he put him in his privy, his private privy, to hide the evidence. And the police found it very easily, and they were able to go down there and retrieve it because these privies were basically just a vault, like a pit underneath. Some, like Jefferson's, had some sort of mechanism of washing things away, but most did not. They had to be physically emptied. And so the things in there sat there, and they can sit there for hundreds of years to now when people from today can see what people put in them. And so those are my three main ideas. It was hard to choose what to focus on because I think there are a lot of ways this could go, but I decided to sort of stay away from architectural discussion and things like that and focus more on the experience of the people and who built this, who used it, who cleaned it. And yeah, that is my project.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. That's great. And yes, you can stop sharing your screen.
Okay, let me stop recording.